Okay, so you know how it is like some figures from history just totally grab you. The ones where it's like, is it real? Is it legend? It all gets kind of blurry. And, we're talking King Arthur, right?
Yeah, yeah, King Arthur. That's right. The one and only. All those romantic stories of Camelot, the knights, the Round Table. But what's the actual story? I mean, like, is there a real story under all that?
Exactly. And today we're going to dive into that with this really interesting article that I think you dug up, right?
I did, yeah, it's a good one. A real deep dive into whether there was like an actual historical Arthur. So our mission today is really, can we separate the myth from the man? And if there was a real guy, where the heck was he? Most people probably picture him down south, right?
Yeah, totally. Like when I think Arthur, it's like Tintagel, Cornwall, all those places. Glastonbury.
Right, exactly. Like super southern England vibes. But this article is a bit of a curveball. It focuses on those 12 battles that are attributed to Arthur, in that ninth century book, the Historia Brittonum.
Yeah, okay, I see where this is going.
They've always been super hard to pin down. Like, all these different scholars come up with different ideas, and it gets really messy.
I did like a total rabbit hole, I bet.
Well, the article actually calls it a tar pit for the unwary, which I think is pretty accurate. But anyway, the big argument here is that 11 out of 12 of those battles, they're actually pointing towards locations way up north, like Northumberland and southern Scotland.
Whoa. Okay, so not the South at all.
Nope, it's saying Arthur was a North Briton, more specifically from the kingdom of Strathclyde, which kind of throws everything we think we know out the window, right?
Yeah, it really does. It's like a totally different image of the guy. And it's interesting, the article mentions how people have been trying to solve this puzzle for ages. I mean, going all the way back to John Leland in the 1500s.
Oh yeah, he was one of the first to actually try and record those battle locations. But even back then, the place names were already pretty messed up.
Oh, wow. So like even that early, the stories were getting jumbled.
It seems like it. Like, he even had Arthur fighting Anglo-Saxons down in Kent, which is way off. So it shows you how fluid the whole legend was right from the start.
So even back then, the Arthur story was being like shaped and molded. That's fascinating. Did any of the later scholars do any better at figuring out where Arthur might have been?
Well, Sir John Lloyd, who was writing in the early 1900s, he was way more cautious. He looked into names, and he admitted, yeah, some of them seemed to point north. But he basically decided the list was just a random bunch of famous battles from that time period and didn't really help to pinpoint Arthur's campaigns. He even pointed to the city of the Legion, which a lot of people said was Chester. But Chester wasn't really attacked until much later by the Northumbrians, so he's like, see, this list is all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. Like if you have supposed battles in the North and the South, it's kind of hard to see how one guy would be everywhere.
Exactly. And what it shows is there's no clear evidence to put Arthur in the South specifically. Everyone's just working with these tiny little clues and then filling in the blanks with their own ideas.
So it's like a historical puzzle with some pieces missing, and then everyone's making up their own pieces to fit the gaps.
Pretty much, yeah. So then you have Hugh Williams, and he had a slightly different take. He said some battles happened near Hadrian's Wall up north, but others were down south. And the southern ones, he said, were against different groups of Anglo-Saxons.
Okay, so he saw Arthur as like fighting on two different fronts.
Yeah, like a two-pronged campaign. But then Sir Edmund Chambers came along and he was like, no, no, no. The source of this whole list is from southeast Wales or Dumnonia, and he's all about how it connects to the Anglo-Saxons invading Kent. He also brings up Mommsen's version of the Historia Brittonum text, which actually points out how there are lots of different spelling and readings of the place names, so even the text itself isn't totally reliable.
Oh, man. So it's like every layer you peel back just makes it more complicated. All these different versions of the names must have been a nightmare.
Oh, yeah. Total nightmare. And then you have John Lloyd-Jones, who did all of this work on early Welsh poetry. And his point was like, look, you got to understand what these names actually meant in the old Brythonic languages. Otherwise, you're just matching random sounds on a map. He looked at names like Baden, Bruin, Sileden, Dublis, Glein, and showed how shaky their traditional locations actually were.
Okay, so not just matching names, but like digging into the linguistics.
Exactly. You got to speak the language of the time to even start to untangle this mess.
It's like a code you have to crack. So we've seen all these early guys with their different ideas, but where did things go from there? The article mentions the Chadwitts and Robin Collingwood as having some pretty different perspectives.
Yeah, so the Chadwicks, they made this interesting point about the Historia Brittonum mentioning all these Arthurian wonders around the Welsh border, like Arthur's dog's supposed grave and his son's tomb. So at first they were thinking maybe Arthur was from Southeast Wales. But then there's that mention of the Caledonian Wood, which is definitely in Scotland. So they're like, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. And in the end, they became pretty skeptical about the whole list as a real historical record. They thought maybe it came from a bunch of old Welsh battle poems that weren't necessarily all about the same Arthur or even about fighting the English.
So they were like, maybe it's more poetry than history.
Exactly, like a collection of heroic stories that all got attached to Arthur over time. Then you have Robin Collingwood, who was this archaeologist who studied Roman Britain, and he had this super imaginative view of Arthur. He thought he wasn't a local king, but like a high-ranking commander of a mobile army that went all over Britain fighting with local troops.
Wow, like a general leading a rapid response force.
Yeah, exactly. And he actually thought that the fact some of the battle names were so obscure that actually meant they were real. He's like, if you were making up a list, you'd use famous places, right? So he even tried to say that Camlin, where Arthur dies, was the Roman fort of Camboglana, which is now Bertaswald on Hadrian's Wall.
I mean, that does fit with the whole mobile army idea, but using the fact that names are obscure as proof they're real, that seems like a stretch.
Yeah, it has its problems. He was super into Roman military stuff, so he was kind of trying to fit Arthur into that whole world.
I see. Okay, so we've got the Chadwicks thinking poetry and Collingwood thinking Roman military. What about the Welsh scholars? What do they make of all this?
They bring a lot to the table because they really understand the languages and the history. Some suggested that certain names like Gwynedd in Ceredigion were actually named after local chiefs, so maybe some of these battles were very regional. Albert Williams kind of agreed that Arthur could have been from the southeast or the north, like maybe he was this mobile leader going all over. And then Henry Lewis, he was on the fence about the Caledonian Wood and Mountbatten, but he did think Camlin could have been up north on Hadrian's Wall, like Collingwood's idea.
Okay, so even among the Welsh experts, it was still kind of split, north-south, who knows?
Yeah, exactly. And then there's this really important scholar, Kenneth Jackson. He was a big deal when it came to language, like a real expert. And his whole thing was that Arthur was not from the north.
Okay, so team south for him.
Totally team south. He placed Mountbatten or Swindon in southern England and didn't even think Arthur was originally connected to that battle at all. He was all about how Arthur's enemies were these southeastern Saxons. And get this, he thought the whole battle list was basically from a later poem written in like everyday language, just listing off battles. And he compared it to other poems about figures like Cadwallon and Cynan Garwin and using like linguistic stuff, said this poem was from after the time Arthur would have been around.
Whoa, okay, so he's like using the language itself to debunk the whole Northern Arthur idea?
Exactly. He was very anti-North. But then one of his own students, Rachel Bromwich, she actually became a huge advocate for the Northern Arthur. She used this line from the Gododin, which is this collection of poems about warriors from the North. And she basically said, look, these 12 battles are way too spread out for one guy to have fought them all. She thought they probably came from an early battle poem, maybe even one about a Northern hero who then got mixed up with Arthur later on.
So it's like the stories got blended together over time.
Yeah, exactly. She also said maybe some of the place names in the list got corrupted and were originally northern locations. And she even suggested that some of the battles were Britons fighting each other and not just against the Anglo-Saxons.
Okay, so not just one united British front, but maybe different British groups clashing? That's a really interesting idea. It adds a whole other layer of complexity to the whole thing.
Absolutely. She really pushed this idea that the Arthur stories might actually have come from the north and then spread south later and got attached to all these different places and battles.
Wow. Okay, so that's a pretty big shift in thinking. And what about the scholars who were maybe more skeptical about Arthur existing at all?
Yeah, so you have people like Geoffrey Ashe. He was kind of on board with Arthur being this mobile warlord, but thought trying to find every little battle site was a waste of time. Just focus on the bigger picture, he said. Nora Chadwick, she knew about Ferdinand Lot, who had argued for a northern Arthur, but she wasn't convinced because so many of the locations are unknown.
It does seem like nailing down those locations was a problem for everyone. What about Kenneth Jackson again? Didn't he have some strong opinions?
Oh yeah, Jackson was super skeptical of anyone saying the battles were in the north. He called a lot of those ideas nonsense. But even he offered suggestions for some locations. He put Baden in Wessex, the city of the Legion, as Chester the Caledonian Wood in Strathclyde, and Linewis in Lindsey. He was convinced the list was from this later poem and just totally rejected the northern identifications.
Okay, so he's still sticking to his guns. Southern Arthur all the way.
Yeah, he was firm on that. But then Count Tolstoy did this massive survey of all the different theories, and he went all out and actually suggested locations for all 12 battles. It was a real mix of northern and western places. Like he put Glyne in Northumberland, Douglas Linuance, near Loch Lomond Bassus, near Cambuslang in Scotland, the Caledonian Forest and the southern uplands, but then Gwinion in Cornwall and Baden near Bath. So he's kind of trying to take everything into account.
So trying to fit every possible piece into the puzzle, even if it ends up looking a bit messy.
Yeah, exactly. And then Leslie Alcock, who was this archaeologist, he got into the idea that a lot of the battles happened at river crossings. He even included a map in his book with all these possible locations showing how hard it was to be sure about places like Bassus Gwinion and Tribrut. And he was open to Bath being Baden, but made a really important point. He said the name Baden has to be Celtic, which means Bath can't be right because its name comes from Old English.
Oh, wow. So the name itself gives us a clue.
It does, and it shows how important language is to all this.
Yeah, it's like the language holds the key to unlocking the real story.
Totally. Okay, so after all this back and forth, does the idea of a northern R start to gain more traction?
It sounds like it from the way the article goes. What about Charles Thomas? He was an archaeologist too, right?
Yeah, he was. And he tried to find actual archaeological evidence to back up any of the battle locations, but honestly, he didn't find much that was conclusive. Maybe a southern Botten, some possibilities in Cheshire and Lincolnshire, and a couple in southern Scotland. He was really skeptical that Arthur would have fought in all 12 battles himself. But here's the thing, he made a really strong statement. He said all the early stuff about Arthur before the medieval period is categorically northern. He's saying Arthur's roots are in southern Scotland, and that he only became this universal British hero later on as the legends spread.
So even from an archaeological perspective, the North seems to be winning out. And what about Rachel Bromwich? Did she say anything more about this?
Yeah, so she kept hammering home that the oldest sources really tie Arthur to North Britain, not southwest England. She kept going back to the Gododin and the Historia Brittonum. Her theory developed to say Arthur was probably a big leader in North Britain around the year 500, and the stories about him spread south later.
So like a ripple effect going out from the north.
Yeah. She also tried to place him in the East Riding of Yorkshire at one point, but that wasn't as convincing. But her main idea, a northern Arthur, that stuck.
And it seems like there's even more evidence for a northern connection hidden in some of the old Welsh poetry, right?
Right. So there's this manuscript called the Black Book of Carmarthen, which is from the 1200s, but it has older stuff in it. And there's a poem that mentions a fight at a place called Tribrut, and it connects it to Edinburgh. And guess what? That links directly to Tribrut in the Historia Brittonum list.
Whoa. Okay, so that's pretty solid evidence for a northern location for at least one of the battles.
Exactly. It all starts to add up. So through language archaeology and even poetry, all the clues are pointing north. But then there's this period where some scholars actually questioned whether Arthur was real at all.
Oh, wow. So after all this debate about where he was, suddenly it's like, did he even exist?
Exactly. In the 1970s, some big names like David Dumbill, they really started challenging the whole idea of a historical Arthur. And that created a wave of doubt in academia. Like maybe he was stuffed a myth. Even Peter Solway, who wrote about Roman Britain, he talked about how the historical Arthur was becoming this really slippery figure.
It's like the whole foundation of the debate shifted.
Yeah, totally. From arguing about where he fought to did he even fight at all?
That's wild.
It is. Charles Thomas and James Campbell, they agreed with this skepticism and pointed to how there wasn't much solid evidence to prove Arthur existed. But then John Morris, in a book published after he died, he had this different take. He said the Historia Brittonum list, even if it wasn't exactly true, might be a summary of a lost Welsh poem that was based on real events. And he thought those battles were probably up north and were about conquering the Highlands after the Britons beat the English down south. But there were a couple exceptions around the Douglas and Witham areas.
So even among those who doubted Arthur, they were still trying to find some grain of truth in the stories.
Yeah, they were. Peter Hunter Blair, he still thought the battles were all over the place, even in Northumbria. But Simon Evans, he was way more cautious and only felt sure about one place, the River Glen in Northumberland. Rachel Bromwich, even though she looked into some possible southern connections later on, she always came back to the idea that the first sources put Arthur in North Britain.
So despite all the doubts, the Northern Arthur theory still had some strong supporters. And then the article gets into what it calls the most convincing evidence, place names.
Right, this is where it gets really interesting. They use all this work done by William Watson on Scottish Celtic place names and say that's the key to finding the real battle locations.
It makes sense. Place names can last for centuries. They're like echoes of the past, aren't they?
They are, yeah. So the article focuses on some key examples like Kirginzion in Galloway. It used to be called Kirkquinnen, and that name is linked to St. Finbar or Unchinian, who'd be Gwinion in Welsh. And because of where it is, the article suggests that this could be the Castellum Gwinion from the Historia Brittonum. The dates might not perfectly match up with St. Ninian, but maybe there was an earlier Gwinion. So there's a possible link, even if we're not totally sure about the exact timing.
Okay, so like a possible connection between a place today and one of Arthur's battles.
Yeah, exactly. Then there's Carrick Lion near Kinneil on the Antonine Wall. They say this is a Cumbric term meaning Rock of the Legion, and that this could have been mixed up later with the Welsh Caer Legion, which means Fort of the Legion, and was an old name for Chester. This actually solves a big problem because it explains why a battle at the City of the Legion would be in this list. You don't have to try and connect it to that much later attack on Chester.
So it's like a linguistic solution to a historical puzzle.
Exactly. The language clears things up. Then there's this name Bussus, and the article suggests it's actually a messed up version of Taurus, which is connected to the Welsh word tros, meaning strong. And that leads to two possible spots, Moss Water near Carstairs or Terrace Water in Eskdale, both in southern Scotland and both near Roman roads. So which one it is might depend on whether the battle was an attack or defending Strathclyde.
So the name changes over time and hides the original meaning.
Yeah, it's like deciphering a secret code. And then finally, there's Douglas and Linuis, and they make this really clever argument. They say Linuis should actually be Clutuus, which was the name for the people of Strathclyde. And that means the four battles at Douglas, which means Darkwater, were actually on the River Douglas in Strathclyde. This was a super important area for defending the kingdom. And there's even support for this in an old Welsh poem called Arms Prydein that mentions Cornu, Acclidwis, Cornwall, and the Clyde together, suggesting they were connected somehow. So using all this place name analysis, the article firmly puts four of Arthur's battles in southern Scotland.
Okay, so it's really starting to build a solid picture of Arthur in the north.
It is, yeah. And then they go back to Mons Dodonis, which is Mountbatten, the most famous of Arthur's victories. And here they say it's probably not connected to Scotland or to Arthur at all in the early stories. They suggest changing Baden to Braden and linking it to Brayton Forest and Ringsbury Hill near Swindon. Their point is that the Battle of Baden was a big win for the Britons, but that Ambrosius Aurelianus was probably the one who led it. Arthur only got connected to it much later as the legend grew.
So the most famous Arthurian battle might not even have been about Arthur.
Yeah, it's like the whole story got rewritten over time. But anyway, after that, they start suggesting locations for the other battles in Scotland and Northumberland, like the Caledonian Forest. They say that's probably the area around Beatock Summit in southern Scotland, a really important spot on the Roman Rose. Then there's this tricky name, Aledid, and they think it's a corrupted version of Old Welsh words for death, and connect it to Penango, near Howick in Tiviotdale, which was another military route. The River Glen, they say that's definitely the glen in Northumberland part of Gododin territory and near some old royal residences, so maybe an attack on a local power base. And Tribrew, which means speckled, they link that to Jeva in Upper Tweeddale, again on a Roman road, showing how important the River Tweed was for getting around.
So these battles that used to seem so mysterious are starting to find their place in the actual landscape. What about Bruin and Cameron? Those are big ones in the Arthur stories.
Right, so Bruin, they identify that with the Roman fort of High Rochester, or Braminium, up in Northumberland. And that location shows up in a poem by Taliesin, but it's about Urien Regid, not Arthur. So maybe the glory got transferred to Arthur later on. And in some later versions of the Historia Brittonum, there are these notes that say Iend is the same as Burgwine and Catbregion, which again points to a northern location for Aeneid, and really backs up the idea that it's Penango. And then Camlin, where Arthur's last battle happens, they agree with this guy O.G.S. Crawford, who said it was probably the Roman fort of Cambaglana, now called Castle Studs on Hedring's Wall. And the fact that so many other battles are up north supports that idea. And it also makes the Annales Cambria entry about Arthur and Medjod dying there in 537 seem more believable as a real event.
So even the place where Arthur meets his end fits into this northern picture. So if you put it all together, where are these battles happening?
So based on this analysis, pretty much all of them except one are either in southern Scotland, 7 out of the 12, or up in Northumberland, the River Glen, plus Bruin High Rochester and Camlin Castlesteads. The only one that's different is Baden, which they put in Wiltshire down south. But remember they said Arthur probably wasn't involved in that one originally. So yeah, very northern focus. And the locations for Glen Douglas, High Rochester, and Castlestead, those are seen as the strongest. And then linking High Rochester and those later notes about aid makes the northern location for that battle even more likely.
Wow, okay, so that's a totally different map of Arthur's world than what we're used to. What does all this mean for how we understand 6th century Britain and who Arthur might have been?
Well, it's pretty huge. First of all, it makes it much more likely that Arthur was a real person and not just a made-up legend, and his Roman name Artorius adds to that. Second, the fact that most of the battles are in the territories of Raegad and Gododin, with the ones in Strathclyde seeming like they were about defending the kingdom, means that Arthur was probably from Strathclyde himself, like a general in the early 6th century.
Okay, so not some king from down south, but a northern warrior.
Yeah, and being from the north and maybe not being royalty in the south would explain why he's not in those old Welsh family trees, which are all about the southern dynasties. And if most of his fighting was up north, then his enemies were probably other North British kingdoms, not just the Anglo-Saxons, which makes sense because there was always a lot of tension and fighting between those groups. And that would also explain why he's not in the early English histories written by Bedade and Gildas, who were focused on the south. And then he's not in the earliest Welsh poetry praising Bedoded and Raegad heroes, which makes sense if he was their rival or from a different faction.
So a more complex picture of the north emerges. Not just Britons versus Saxons, but Britons versus Britons.
Exactly. And all the battles being in this relatively small area challenges that romantic image of Arthur as this great cavalry commander riding all over Britain. Plus, being from Strathclyde means he wasn't some Romanized southern landowner, which goes against some of the later portrayals. And the analysis also says pretty clearly that Arthur wasn't at the Battle of Badon, which they link to Braden, remember, and that the early Welsh sources don't connect him to it. But his death at Camlann, identified as Castlestead's and dated to 537, it seems like it was a real event that became part of the legend.
It really flips the whole traditional Arthur story on its head.
It does, but even though the original story is different, he clearly became super important to people later on, especially in the north. Like, there's a guy named Artur who was the grandson of Eadhain mac Nabrang, a king of Dalriada in early Scotland. So that shows Arthur's name and the stories about him had spread and were really respected. And the northern connection is even stronger because Eadhain's mother, Luin, she was British, probably from Manaw Gododin, next to Strathclyde. So that puts Arthur in the same world as these people.
So even centuries later, you see Arthur's influence in Scotland.
You do, and there's this inscribed stone at Yarrow Kirk in southern Scotland that commemorates some British princes who have Latin names, which shows that they still used Roman naming traditions in the north at this time. So someone like Arthur, with his Roman name Artorius, was probably Christian, spoke both Latin and British, and was pretty high status. So basically, the article concludes that putting Arthur in the north as this powerful warrior, mostly in Strathclyde, who died at Castlestead's, helps us understand a period of Scottish history that we don't know much about. And it fits with other recent research that's been done on 6th century southern Scotland.
So for you, our listener, the takeaway here is pretty huge. This research is saying that Arthur wasn't down south in England like most people think, but was actually up north in Scotland, which is pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is, and it forces us to rethink the whole picture of 6th century Britain. It wasn't this united front against the Saxons, but a much more complicated world where British kingdoms were fighting each other, and Arthur as this symbol of British unity that was probably a much later invention.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how legends get started and how our understanding of history changes when we look at the evidence in a new way. So if Arthur's battles were mostly in the north and were against other Britons, what does that tell us about the relationships between those different kingdoms? It's a really intriguing question, isn't it?
It really is. And if you want to learn more about all this amazing linguistic detective work and the arguments laid out in the article, we definitely recommend checking it out yourself. It'll make you rethink everything you thought you knew about King Arthur.